Oh, yeah, we need to emulate.
Yeah, it's just a bit of a fight.
Oh, yeah, no, it's just that. Yep.
Hello everyone. Hello. Alright, welcome everyone to the grand final of Joynt 2020. Let's have a quick round of applause for A1 and B1. Awesome. The motion of the grand final is what you can see up on the screen above us, the motion about public health officials and COVID response. Without any further ado, is there anything else I'd like to say? No, let's get underway then. So I'll welcome up the first speaker of the Affirming team. That's the bell.
Fundamental truth at the start of this debate is that on both sides of this debate, the fundamental response and the immediate response that New Zealand takes to COVID is primarily political. The government is the one that decides the majority of the policy decisions that dictate the shape of New Zealand's response to COVID. So what this debate is about is not necessarily about the initial policy directions that are taken, but over whether it is better to have politicians front up for the decisions that politicians primarily have made, or whether it is better to put someone who is an expert and part of the public service in front. So that's the debate we're having today. Firstly, I'm going to walk you through what it is that we support, and then I'm going to go through 2 points of substantive. The first of those is about the capacity for deflected responsibility. That means that politicians have a lessened degree of accountability of the decisions that they make. And secondly, I'm going to talk about impartiality and the quality of advice within the public service, why that is harmed, and in the long term, why that can be extremely damaging to New Zealand. Firstly then, what do we support? Basically, we still think there is some role potentially for officials to play in the briefings. For example, there are lots of public servants other than Ashley Bloomfield who sometimes turn up in the briefings when there are particularly technical things related specifically to their job and their decisions made under statutory authority, that they are the ones that they need to explain. But what we don't support is basically what's been taking place under the Labour government, which is just Ashley Bloomfield emceeing a big meeting where everyone hoorahs about how great the Labour Party is. Our goals in this debate are a few things. We want quality of response. We don't want people to die. We would prefer a scenario in which we are, to the best of our ability, to save the New Zealand economy. But on top of that, we also want accountability for politicians for the decisions that they made in order for the ongoing health of New Zealand's democracy to be upheld. Let's talk firstly then about deflected responsibility. And the first thing I want to talk about right at the top of this point is, what does a good response look like? Yes, a good response to COVID is quick, it's effective, it does its job, but it's also the case that the response to COVID changes over time. It is a situation that is constantly in flux, although I guess now we're out the other side, it's kind of the other way, we're kind of looking back in time here. But what we say in this debate is that the government needs accountability mechanisms in order to make sure that things go as well as they can. Because a lot of the decisions that are made are political decisions made by politicians, we need some degree of accountability to make sure that those politicians are doing the best job, making the best decisions, and therefore saving the most lives, saving the most jobs, etc. A couple of reasons why why politicians are less accountable in the decisions that they make in the circumstance where a public servant takes a stand and is the one that fronts up. First of those reasons, an important component of just democratic accountability in general is making politicians face up to hard questions. When a politician has to stand up, no thank you, Shah, when a politician has to stand up and explain a decision that they made and is unable to, that is an extreme public embarrassment that reflects poorly on them. There is a strong personal incentive for them, therefore, to make sure that they have all of the information that they need to make decisions at all times, to make sure that they are backing up everything that they are doing, that they are seeking the highest quality of advice possible. But beyond that personal incentive, there is also incentive in terms of party politics to make sure that you don't have anyone like a David Clark figure getting egg on their face all of the time, because that looks very bad for the party. So there are strong norms within the political parties themselves that mean that the ministers always keep themselves maximally up to date. Therefore, when ministers are under scrutiny and feel under scrutiny, they make sure that they are on the ball all the time. Given that they are making decisions, if we are able to prove in this debate that they are making sure they have the best advice possible and making sure they are up to date with things as best as they can, that is a significant benefit. Secondly, as I explained at the top of this speech, the government ultimately will do what it wants. These are political decisions that are made, but in the circumstance where you have a public servant who is standing up there and becomes the face of the response, people associate that person with that response. They attribute some sort of responsibility for the response to that person. But on top of that, there are circumstances in which the politicians themselves actively promote that by saying that their hands are tied by the experts who are making the decisions behind the scenes. It's not true that the politicians' hands are tied and the decisions are all made by experts behind the scenes. So we prefer a system in which the government is forced to take full responsibility for the decisions that it makes, rather than being able to palm those decisions off to other people and therefore avoid political consequences for potential mistakes that they made. What does it mean when we have politicians standing up, having some degree of accountability? Or actually, what does it mean when we don't offer them that accountability? Firstly, it allows for soft responses. It is a good political decision to go in soft on COVID and to blame the scientists and blame Ashley Bloomfield and those sorts of people for being the reason why you had to do that, because your hands were tied by the civil service. That is a good political decision because you're able to save constituents and you make a little gamble with people's lives effectively to save a few more jobs or whatever, to make sure that people are happy with you, because if you go in hard and early, people get angry at you for all the jobs go, whatever. So it's better for you to make a soft response, and if it goes wrong, just blame it on someone else. That means people lose their lives. Secondly though, it ensures personal effort from politicians. David Clark probably wouldn't go mountain biking or wouldn't go to the beach if Ashley Bloomfield had not been there. Thirdly, you don't get short-term accountability for those politicians. David Clark ought to have been sacked almost immediately after the COVID response took place because he was fundamentally incompetent. But he stuck around for a very, very long time, and people lost their lives as a result of that because there was an accountability palm off to the public service. I'll take you in a moment. Incompetent politicians make decisions that affect people's lives. They should be subject to short-term accountability that forces them to be sacked for the sake of for the sake of party politics. Overall, the response to COVID is better, faster, more accurate, and more likely to change to changing circumstances in the situation where you have a high degree of accountability. I'll take a PY.
Sam, public health officials almost always advocated for a harsher response, not a softer response. Why doesn't this then give governments cover to implement that harder response to save lives?
So what I'm going to explain is that it's very difficult for the public service to go back on itself or to disagree with the line that the government wants to push when they're forced to be the public face. So sorry to be here's the next part of my speech, but this is going to directly respond to that POI. Impartial advice is important to the government because experts know what needs to be done, but also experts have to advise many governments after them, and they have a substantial amount of influence over the policies that future governments take. Note, most of the things that public servants do, like their usual anonymity, the fact that they're apolitical, those sorts of things, rely on strong conventions that we think that we ought to protect. First problem when you have someone stand up from the public service. It is very difficult to criticise the decision that is made by the government. For a couple of reasons. Firstly, when you have Ashley Bloomfield stand up and say, do this is the policy we have adopted, that is an expert endorsement of the decision that the politicians have decided to take. You have Ashley Bloomfield, who is an expert, saying, we have to do this thing. But it is not necessarily because he has made that decision or because he as an expert believes that it's the right thing to do, but because it is his job now, apparently, just to stand there and say to do the things that the Labour government wants you to do. But on top of that, it's extraordinarily difficult to simultaneously tell someone to do something and then to then go backtrack on that when the situation changes. And this is where we get response to that POI. There are personal incentives that prevent Ashley Bloomfield from going back on something that he said a week ago, because it looks very bad for him, because it looks very bad for the ministry that he fronts, and so there are internal incentives there that cause ministries, cause Ashley Bloomfield personally to be biased towards sticking with the status quo rather than showing that they made a mistake in the past and showing that something else needed to be done. Ultimately, Ashley Bloomfield has become a political figure in New Zealand. He has saved the Labour Party from a significant degree of embarrassment. People lost their lives to COVID in New Zealand. We think that might not have happened under a more competent system.
Thank you very much for that speech, Sam. Now welcome up Umbar.
Just listen to the last sentence of Sam's speech. People lost their lives in New Zealand with a public health official at the head who Labour deflected to and said, don't use political gambits to put lives at risk. We need to go hard, fast and early. What they stand for on their side of the house is Jacinda Ardern being the face of attack. The face that National stands up and says she wants to ruin businesses. She doesn't know anything about lives. We can take a soft stance and save lives. Why do you end up within that circumstance? You get the US, right? You get UK, you get all of the countries that have put politicians ahead and bungled their response to coronavirus. When lives are at stake, put the experts at charge. They will take the hit, but they will do the right thing. 3 points in this speech. We're going to characterize who these public officials are and tell you why they're good at their jobs and good at being the face of responses. Secondly, tell you why we get better buy-in and unified responses to pandemics. And lastly, tell you why those responses will always be more effective under our side of the house. First, just by way of setups, we tell you that the comparative is someone has to provide those updates. On their side of the house, it's a politician because they can be held responsible in their world where public health officials can't. We tell you the path to victory in this debate will be the team that gets the best response to pandemics. Literally nothing else matters at the point where human life is at stake and the devastation in other countries has been in the millions. Quick points of response. The first thing they say is that public health officials allow governments to deflect responsibilities. 4 responses, I think. First, accountability comes through voting in elections. If you think that Labour has bungled it with Ashley Bloomfield at the head, vote them out. Second, the official is able to offer critiques on the government. Bloomfield said level 3 should have been longer. He said that as the face, that held more power than if he was someone who's in the back that we didn't even know who he was. Third, public health official always has more incentives than a politician to be fully prepared to front up to responses, but they also have a knowledge advantage, so are able to express that better in ways that their controversial decisions can be communicated. But fourthly, health officials are already charged with lots of responsibilities that governments already take credit for. We think that material is largely symmetric. With regards to soft responses, we think those responses become far more political, so you get worse responses that are politically palatable, so Labour shuts down lockdown early and then nothing gets achieved, but it also suggests by their own material, you get stronger responses to pandemics on our side of the house. We think we can win on that alone. On David Clark, if someone incompetent as a politician was the face and was dropped by the Labour Party, imagine the public response to thinking that we can't trust the people who are in charge and making the decisions. You would lose a lot of buy-in. Finally, on impartial advice, Sam says they have lots of influence over lots of parties. That's good. We use their impartial reputation now to save lives. We're happy to stand by that. But secondly, if public health officials disagree, they are doctors who care about saving lives. These are the kinds of people who are happy to disagree with a government that they think is doing the kinds of bad political things their side stands by. Who are public health officials? They're experts in their field, they are authoritative people, they are doctors who are nurturing and understand what the risk to human lives is. These are smart people. Importantly, they're people the public trusts because they're not bogged down by the ideas of party politics. What do they look like? Firstly, if you're in charge of a public office, you are good at communication. You're someone like Forsey or Bloomfield because that's your job. You front up to select committees. You have to negotiate with politicians, so you know how to communicate complicated ideas already. But secondly, as they suggest, you stay in these positions for a long time. Department heads often don't change. It's a civil service, so if you're good, you don't change. The reason why this is important is because people like Forsey were well known for their response to the AIDS pandemic, right? These are people who have been in government for a long time. They've worked with lots of different parties and people know that they are effective workers. The conclusion of this material is that these are communicators. They know how to be the face of response. This is important because we need to convince the populace that the response will be effective, especially when solutions rely on communicating these theories of complicated healthcare. Compare that to politicians. The first thing we say, sometimes they just don't get the nuance of healthcare, so they struggle to communicate, e.g. Trump just doesn't fucking know what he's talking about half the time. But secondly, even when they can communicate those ideas, they just get stumped by questions by journalists because they don't know the reasoning behind that decision. So when Jacinda can't answer a question, the public is like, why the heck is she in charge of this? Can we trust that the decision she's making is accurate? We think Bloomfield is more likely to have the answers, so that's good. Why do we get better buy-in? Note the first thing we say here is that you need massive buy-in as much as possible for these responses to work. Because you need a unified response, you need cooperation with policies for them to work, because lockdown is only as effective as its weakest link. You need everyone believing that it's effective for it to work. That's where other countries have failed at the cost of lives. The second thing to note, though, is that politicians just don't get the same level of buy-in. Firstly, they are by nature one part of the political spectrum. So as an individual, you might oppose them for ideological reasons or just dislike the policies they put in place before. Secondly, the opposition parties have incentive to criticize them for votes, but often the criticisms are counterproductive because the easiest line of attack is just to say their actions are excessive, we ought not to do them. But the third thing to say is the media finds it really easy to attack politicians on party lines and say their actions are bad. The result is the public is less likely to believe that the actions that politicians are taking are good for everyone and you get less buy-in. Why do public servants change that? The first thing to say is the governing party is the one that's given them the platform. So you get the support of all the Labour voters in New Zealand because they know that Jacinda likes Bloomfield. But importantly, the opposing party struggles to attack them or just doesn't because you don't want to go through the optics of looking like you're attacking a neutral public servant who is helping save lives. The media doesn't attack these people as fiercely as they do politicians because they show them as experts who know information. They communicate that information in the same way the spin-off did in New Zealand, right? You get far more buy-in on our side of the house. That means that response is more effective. I'll go into those responses POI.
Why on earth would we not want the opposition party to be sharply and constantly critiquing the quality of government response?
Yes. No, I love this, right? Because when the Democrats critique Trump, they're not critiquing him because he didn't implement lockdown early enough. They're just saying, Trump is too dumb to handle this pandemic. Why would conservatives ever find that as like a critical attack that actually leads to constructive changes? On our side of the house, you can say, Ashley Bloomfield, we think you should have considered the impacts on business a little bit more, but we understand you're doing a good job because you're a neutral public servant and we don't want to attack the good work you do. On their side of the house, National just gets up and Judith's like, fucking crush Jacinda. We don't say that. Why are responses more effective? First thing, public health officials advocate for stronger policy that helps political minorities like elderly people or brown people who don't have votes to sway governments. They respond the fastest, but they also consider stress to the healthcare system. We give them more bargaining power under our side of the house. When you are the face of a political response, you get a media platform. You firstly have more power to outwardly critique the responses of the government in charge, like Bloomfield did and like Forsey does. But secondly, the threat of your outward power allows you to wield more power on the inside, just like Bloomfield does. The second thing to say here, though, is the threat to undermine is incredibly important, especially in countries that haven't handled the crisis as well as we have done. These officials are often principled people who care about saving the lives of the people in their country. That's why, under Bolsonaro, health officials immediately flooded in resignations because they didn't agree with what the administration was doing. They didn't want that blood on their hands. The face of a movement that is trying to stop a pandemic, resigning is an incredibly bad indictment of how a country is doing. You are far more able to call out bad policy in a world where that face is a public health servant. That's why we save more lives under our side.
In Sweden and the UK in the early weeks of the pandemic, opposition parties largely held back on criticizing the herd immunity responses that the governments had decided to develop because of the nonpartisan thinking that the negating team wanted to foster. Those responses caused quite literally tens of thousands of deaths, and if we had had a more robust political debate in Parliament in which those plans were actually put under the spotlight and more intensively critiqued, we could have avoided those deaths. The argument of the negating team in this debate is a fundamentally undemocratic argument that ignores the basic mechanisms through which democracies encourage governments to make good responses. It is also a completely utopian and unrealistic case because their utopian conception of the world is in one in which the party in power, which for some reason has perfect benevolent incentives, just decides to pursue a nonpartisan response on the advice of public health officials, when in reality they have strong political incentives to implement the response that they want, regardless of what the public health official said. That was the crucial point of context that Penno brought to you that wasn't substantively responded to. Because what Penno explained is that the nature of the initial response is always going to be determined by the fundamental political incentives of the party in power, regardless of whether there is a public health official fronting up to it. The difference under their side is that you have a public health official forming the face and the scapegoat of a response that in reality has been totally engineered by politicians. New Zealand is a complete outlier in the sense that our response was mostly engineered by the civil service. In most of the world, it was engineered by politicians. They failed to engage with that context, they lose this debate. Three things in the speech. Firstly, three pieces of rebuttal to their central contentions. Then I'll gatekeep our 2 points about accountability and about how you remove the ability of the public service to critique the government. The first contention from them was that public servants give politicians cover to implement harsher lockdowns. The first thing we say is that this is reliant on an inherently slimy mechanism that is corrosive to democracy because it relies on the idea that government should escape accountability and the will of the public in order to allow it to implement something the public doesn't want to implement. In the particular case of the COVID-19 pandemic, maybe that would have worked out well because the right response happens to be one that the public opposed. But they gave us no long-term systematic reasons to expect that this is the case in most of the future. In many cases in the future, there may be responses that the public wants that will also be the optimal response, but the government has selfish incentives not to do. The fundamental point of democracy is that so that on average in the long term you get the right responses, you have to make the politicians accountable to the public, right? They completely remove that mechanism of accountability, and their case requires them to remove that mechanism of accountability because they assume that it allows the government to implement unpopular policies. Again, by a freak of nature that may have worked out in this pandemic, but there is no explanation from them on why that works on average in the long term. By contrast, the accountability mechanisms provided by democracy give the governments the right incentives to actually implement the right policies. More specifically to the COVID-19 pandemic, though, it just isn't true that public servants universally called for harsher lockdowns. In Sweden and the UK, as I alluded to in my introduction, public servants and scientists were behind the disastrous herd immunity response. In the US, the CDC told people not to wear masks and banned states from developing tests. If we had had more robust political discussion, maybe these things could have been prevented. Their characterization of political accountability is that it's just the opposition party throwing cheap shots at, the government. Firstly, this characterization should be completely undermined by Umbar's farcical insistence that Democratic politicians have just been saying, orange man bad, and not, as they have been, repeatedly and consistently issuing press statements that say how disastrous it is that lockdowns weren't adopted earlier. Joe Biden every day releases a new ad on Twitter that provides reams of statistics behind inspiring music about how bad and precisely breaking down the ways in which the government's response was bad. And there are fundamental structural incentives to that, right? Because people might have fun with the cheap political shots and the Crusher Collins in normal times, but in a pandemic, when people are dying, the public realizes that this is not the time for cheap political discussions. Public discussion and political discussion sobers up, and that is when politics actually holds the government to account. I'll take a few on now.
What matters in healthcare pandemics is a quick response. The accountability you stand for can happen in the years to follow if the response was bad, but on our side, you can implement that response quickly with a lot of buy-in. Why is that so
What
bad?
matters is not a quick response because the information that you initially receive may not be fully informative of the actual nature of the pandemic. Another crucial piece of context I missed from Penno's speech is that the situation is constantly evolving, firstly as circumstances change, and secondly as more and more new information comes to light about the nature of the pandemic and therefore the nature of the required response. That means you need a constantly evolving response where governments are constantly held to account. That's what they lose on their side. Two other quick points of rebuttal. They say public servants are better prepared and skilled at communicating ideas. Reality check. Politics is is the job that selects for skill at public communication and selling and explaining policies in simple terms. Technocracy selects for big brain technocrats thinking way above the room and unable to explain their idea to the public in simple and jargon-free terms. Secondly, they say public servants have a knowledge advantage. Politicians don't know the answers to the questions. That is the point. The politicians should know the answers to those questions, and their system allows politicians to escape responsibility for the fact that they don't know simple facts about their response. That's the entire point of our case. Do I have any other points of extraneous rebuttal? I don't think I do. Okay, let's move on to gatekeeping of our analysis, but first I'll take another POI.
Why is it the case that in your world you guys can stand behind everyone blindly trusting politicians who they hate under status quo, but it's so hard to believe that people might trust in you truly?
Oh, okay. Firstly, we're not relying on people blindly trusting politicians. We're relying on a robust democratic debate that the population can observe. But secondly, their other thing was you get more public buy-in. Thanks, that's the point I forgot to respond. You get more public buy-in. You get these impartial civil servants running up. No analysis for why people trust civil servants, right? The case of Fauci is an anomaly and a bad example for their side because he provided over an administration that let hundreds of thousands of gay people die to AIDS before the government decided it was a problem. No systematic analysis about why public servants are actually trustworthy. Most people are suspicious of them because they're unaccountable technocrats who do things in the shadows. Okay, let's gatekeep our analysis that wasn't really responded to. The first one is a crucial mechanism of accountability in democracies is direct personal questioning of politicians that causes them to break down under media scrutiny and personally embarrass themselves. That's important for two reasons. Firstly, because it personally incentivizes those politicians to be on top of things and know what's going on, but also because it incentivizes parties to appoint competent people who will do a good job for those portfolios, rather than letting internal party politics and, I don't know, getting votes in a leadership race dictate who gets ministerial portfolios. No response to that mechanism about how we get much better health ministers pointed under our side. Moreover, we said that under their side, the government has a convenient public-facing scapegoat. They just embraced that and said that's great because that lets the government do whatever it wants. I explained how that's not true. That will lead the government to do selfish and bad things. Democracy is good. Democracy gives the government good incentive. The second thing we said is that the ability of the public service to critique the government disappears, and the public service is also tasked with being the public face of that response. Because, to take Ashley Bloomfield as an example, if the government decided to end lockdown earlier than Ashley Bloomfield thinks is wise, the ability of Ashley Bloomfield to strongly critique that decision is massively hampered when Ashley Bloomfield also personally has to be the one explaining that decision to the public. That's both because it's personally embarrassing for Ashley Bloomfield to contradict himself, but also crucially because it's embarrassing and a bad look for the Ministry of Health to publicly contradict themselves, which has harmful long-term flow-on consequences in terms of their funding and the responsibilities the government allocates them. Their responses was first, Ashley Bloomfield still did critique the government. Yes, extremely occasionally and very lightly. We got much more of that under our side of the house, which is good. And the second response was, oh, that's fine because the civil service is benevolent. Ashley Bloomfield may be a benevolent god, but the Ministry of Health is a vast institutional apparatus with strong selfish incentives to not critique its own response when it's the public face of its own response. And Ashley Bloomfield can't just go rogue, even if he is great. Their side is undemocratic. Democracy is good. I can't believe I'd be saying that in a debate and that's the clash that will be shaping up, but we're very proud to propose.
Thanks very much, Partridge. And welcome up, Shah.
In a situation like COVID, which is the emotion that we're regretting right now, but any other likely pandemic that's going to come about, which is likely going to be a coronavirus with very similar kinds of spreadability and virulence, you need to act fast. If you don't act fast and spend time having robust debates in Parliament, the virus spreads and the lockdown is just worthless at that point, right? The importance of a quick response shows that that side of the House cares more about democracy than people's lives. The whole point of democracy in those cases is to delegate that kind of responsibility to someone who knows what to do and can make the decision, and afterwards you can hold those governments to account. That side hasn't dealt with the problem that even if the government, by their own characterization, is the person who decides the initial response, that person, that government, is still going to be held accountable, right? The opposition parties, after the effects of the lockdown or whatever has taken place, aren't just going to sit back, right? They're still going to use that in the media, and we think that's what's happening to Trump in the US right now. So it's unclear, even their harms, how it gets worse on their side.
Sure.
I'm going to talk to you about three things. Firstly, how this decision is made, and show how they haven't responded to a lot of the mechanisms that Umbar provided to you in terms of how public health officials actually can control how the decision is made. And that's fatal to them because they only characterize it as the government having the final say in it with no other response. The symmetry of this point is that on their side, the similar kinds of things happen if you accept that there is no kind of accountability mechanism in terms of elections, right? Otherwise, the same point on our side. The next thing I want to do for you is go through talking about the outcomes of that lockdown, right? So firstly, why it's important to have a good communicator, noting that Shakked can respond to our mechanisms as to why politicians are particularly bad communicators, but secondly, talking about why the buy-in from the public is important. Note, again, it's all Shakked said was, oh, they won't trust the technocrat, but we've told you why, specifically in terms of politicians and how polarized politics is right now, that the half the population doesn't vote for the government is unlikely to take that politician seriously. So they have to weigh that up on their side. Firstly, how the decision is actually made. Firstly, they said it's a political decision, it's a gamble, and therefore they're going to do that now when they can shift that accountability off to a public health official. This is just wrong for several reasons, right? Because the mechanization of having a public health official in place is that a public health official is explaining the outcomes of the election. This is even their worst case scenario, is explaining what they're doing. The point at which the public health official does not agree with that kind of policy, then the public health official is going to do things like resign or speak out about it by resigning. That is a mechanism they haven't dealt with. The point is here, I analyze the incentives of that public health official. They're experts in a higher calling than politics, right? They're doctors that care about saving lives, and so therefore they are probably the best person to make that decision. A robust debate in Parliament doesn't account for those things, right? Like saving lives. It accounts for other things, like saving businesses. And also, Umbar gave you specific analysis to show you why public health officials can take into account other things that democracy can't. Because democracy is fundamentally majoritarian. So public health officials can take into account the vulnerable populations of people in society that aren't going to be taken into account in terms of democracy. These are like the elderly, sick people, but also like minorities that might be affected particularly by certain things. And that is what you do when you get public health officials. So what does this mean? So they can use their position to force the government's hand. That is to say they can threaten to resign, no thank you, and that means they wield internal power, but also they can actually resign. This is important not just for like liberal democracies, but for places like Brazil, for example, where the government is then literally has to explain why this very smart person who was the face of that response or previous responses resigned. That is to say that the immediate accountability goes to the government, which is something that you can't get on their side. That is important, especially when the government is not typically accountable to its people. Like in Sri Lanka, where the government wants to not have lockdown and say that COVID doesn't exist in that area, just to have elections. There, the government is going directly against the interests of their people, right? So that's the context they haven't responded to. The other point to note is that there's a unique ability to do the hardline thing while blaming the public health official, if that is the context that they want to talk about, right? So all the incentives for taking the soft line exist on their side as well. If there is no ability to change that, the reason they want to do the soft line, obviously they're a democracy, is because there's a significant part of the population that wants that soft line, right? So people who don't want that lockdown. So the democratic incentives on that government isn't to save lives, but to cater to that group of people. Why is the decision particularly bad? Because firstly, you just have a...
If the Director General of Health in New Zealand wasn't the public face of the COVID response, and they resigned over the fact that the COVID response was bad, do you think everyone would just not notice?
No, they would notice significantly less. But also the point at which you were saying, this is the person who's in charge of the response, and then this person resigns and says, the government wanted me to do something I didn't want to do because of these reasons. They're unlikely then to believe that, oh, the government is doing a fine job about those things. The reason that democracy is bad is because also sometimes people are just dumb, right? They aren't likely to think that this is going to be a big problem. It's harder to see the impact, especially in a pandemic, until it actually happens. So those majoritarian interests are actually now better done on our side when you can have a government that says, well, we had to do this to save lives, and it wasn't our fault that they don't face the political backlash. So either you believe that they can be accountable, which means we went all specific benefits on our side, or they are not held to account, which means that even in the context where people are usually dumb, which is like the US and all other contexts, for all the structural reasons that people don't care about saving lives that aren't their own, we still get better outcomes there. No, thank you. Let's talk about why we get better communication and better buy-in. The point here is to note, right, is that they spend a lot of time talking about that initial response. And I've already characterized the fact that it's really hard to spend that time. You need the initial response even if it's not that good. The point at which you set a lockdown, you need, beyond that initial response, you need people to buy in. Otherwise, that lockdown is useless. So they are only dealing with the initial response. They're talking about how the response is going to be effective in the cases where we do get a good response. In the case where we get a bad response, we're likely also to get a bad response on their side. The point is you need people to feel safe, to, like, for example, to trust the person who is making that policy, to trust the fact that it's going to work, so they're going to give up their own rights, but also to clear up anything that comes up in fake news. This discussion means that Dr. Fauci is actually a good example because he is trusted by many people, considering how he handled the AIDS epidemic a few years ago. The other point of this is that politicians don't necessarily know how to deal with these questions, right? They said politicians should know. The fact that politicians should know actually doesn't mechanize into any outcomes because, again, the initial response has already been done, but politicians can't always know. And that was the information we brought you at Umbar. In those instances where structurally they can't, they look unconvincing, and therefore people are unlikely to believe them and do what needs to be done, for example. Why do you get no buy-in? They said Dr. Fauci is a bad example because he's considered a suspicious technocrat in the shadows. Now we bring him into the spotlight. He becomes a known figure and he's trusted over time, right, in future responses as well. But the comparative is far worse, right, for all the reasons that Umbar provided to you. Politicians, by their very nature, are polarizing. They've been attacking each other for a long time. You feel tribalistic when you belong to a political party. That means that if the Democrats were in power, Trumpians and the Republicans are going to attack them by saying this is a hoax, but also that this is not necessary, the lockdown isn't necessary. That robust debate doesn't actually lead to any good reasoned compromises. It just leads to naysaying, which means that you don't get public buy-in, which means even if you get a good response on their side initially, it doesn't actually work and people die. Look, the point at which democracy fails is the point at which they can't react fast enough. We have structures in place to ensure that people who are experts, public health officials, make those decisions. They're going to make good decisions, side to side, negative.
Thank you very much, Shah. Now welcome up Emily.
Space here. Sorry, I promise I'm not stalling. Nick completely misses the nuance of an approach to COVID when they say you need to act fast and that's it. You also need to act well. You need to act consistently. You need to make decision after decision one week and then the next, when to lift lockdown, when to leave it going, all those different things. Because hypothetically, it is great if a party can act fast, but if their only policy is take a face mask and hope for the best, fast action is bad, and it kills more people than the slight time it would take to have a public debate about whether something is still a good idea or not. In my speech, I'm going to do a few things. Firstly, a discussion on, as I alluded to in my introduction, the best way to approach policy to COVID. Secondly, how do we motivate politicians to make good decisions and form good policy, rather than the assertion from side negative that people were just going to say the things that they should and do the things that they should. And then finally, we're going to talk about effective criticism and buy-in, aka how do we get the best outcomes for these people. So, how do we make, basically we think, as I said, there's multiple different decisions that need to be made, and as that happens over different times, so for example, the lockdown and issuing that is a fast decision that most politicians would still take if they felt the motivation to do so. If they're like, we need to lock down now, they are in Parliament, they have the majority, they have the capacity to do that. It's not about like them being absolutely steamrolled by other things in political party, it's more just the discussion that happens after that decision and that criticism, which means that before the next decision comes along, you get better discourse and you get better policy. So, how do we motivate good decisions? Because we've heard about this very benevolent government from side negative, but frankly, they gave you no incentive as to why these politicians would actually act well. They characterise politicians as only purely self-interested people who don't know how to answer questions unless they're going to be voted out, and frankly, New Zealand is a very rare circumstance where politicians haven't necessarily failed us here. So, what are the different ways that we can get politicians to act effectively? The first thing is they say, no, you have a bargaining tool so you can resign if people don't listen to you. Ashley Bloomfield can say he will sit down. Ashley Bloomfield would absolutely never resign from the position as the face of the campaign. Because if you do that, according to them, that is so detrimental to everyone that the campaign completely falls apart. Sure, Ashley Bloomfield might not have agreed about when level 3 should be released, but he can never actually resign over it, nor would he ever desire to, because he's a doctor, he signed a Hippocratic oath. He doesn't want thousands upon thousands of people to die. He will recognise that working with the government and doing what he can within those constraints is more important than resigning altogether. But actually, we think that this is a water mechanism that can work on our side of the house as well. So, if your face can't resign, that means that you put a lot of effort into making sure your political face is excellent. If David Clark is the face of the campaign, he never would have gone mountain biking, he never would have taken his kids to the beach. The fact that people weren't looking at him was the reason why he had to slip up in the first place, but political parties know that if the face of the campaign, politician that they entrust to be this face, is ineffective or does something bad, then that will destroy the COVID response. Umbar.
Isn't it easier for the UK to change their herd immunity policy when they can blame a healthcare official for it than to have to admit that their political machinations were the ones that fucked up?
Okay, so it works both ways in terms of blaming. Like Sam, this is literally on my page right now. It goes both ways when you make poor decisions at the government and then you force someone to come up and say, yes, I think this is a good policy, I believe so, because it's actually really damaging when most governments are beholden to people like that. They're not health experts. COVID is so rare that people barely could even imagine the potential health consequences that would rise from this. No one wanted to listen to the health officials. So actually, just as much as you can say, our hands are tied, you can say, actually, this has been approved by health officials because he's giving that speech right now. That leads me into effective criticism here. Basically, we think that there is a difference between the sort of criticism and low-level criticism that they're about to talk about and the active participation and criticism that we get on our side of the house. Their criticism has always been a month, a year, a week too late. Basically, Ashley Bloomfield can only ever criticise level 3 once level 3 has been lifted. You cannot be someone who is the face of a campaign and say, you need to do this, also I hate it right now. We need criticism to be active, we need it to be coexisting with the creation of these policies here. So, we actually actually think that effective criticism isn't just the personality politics that they want to talk about. Sure, there's Little Hands Trump and Crusher Judith or whatever, but we also think, as Shakked responded to in his previous speech, that there are often expert opinions because lots of voters do actually care. The idea of COVID is kind of scary, and they do actually want the best outcome for their children and their families. So they will listen to effective criticism, and they will appreciate the party that can make it good for them, guide them through in a way where they feel safe. So, public accountability. They say accountability, you get it via elections. Frankly, if we only held David Clark to account into the future now, that would be absolutely terrible. But secondly, we still think that there will be they said, oh, you'll still get scrutiny in the media and that sort of thing. But the problem with that is, again, what I addressed in the POI is that you now have this blanket or this suggestion that it is an official health decision and that it is objectively good. Also, we think that you get better expert criticism on our side of the house. So, as I said there, in the absence of public services being able to criticise, other people will come in to fill that gap. So, if the media does come in to fill that gap, we say the media has far less information than the public service does, which means that they can't criticise them in the most accurate way, which leads to the best criticism and the best policies. Even worse is you're going to get think tanks like New Zealand Initiative, or God forbid TPU, and these people will come in with personal motivations, for-profit motivations from their donors, from the people who fund them, and they will be the only voice that is allowed to provide their expert opinion. Because you cannot tell someone to do something at the same time as telling them that you think it's a terrible idea, this means that you internally have to present and accept that stuff when it's happening. And this is where acting fast actually comes in, right? Because acting fast means that criticism has to become as quickly as possible. It cannot wait until after the law has been introduced. It cannot wait until a few months down the line. Now, let's talk about buy-in. There are two types of buy-in that Ned wanted to talk about. One is effective communication, and two is tainting with personal optics. On effective communication, they say, oh, they do it all the time. They talk to people all the time. It's very different being able to communicate with other experts in your department or politicians who you can sit down in front of for several hours and take their tiny little brains through every single step of it. It is very different to get up on camera and just speak to millions of people who have never been to university, who have never met you, who have never had the privilege of using words that you come up with when you learned when you were living in a, I don't know, fucking warehouse or something. They say that it's also really technical to explain these things. We told you straight from First Affirmative that we were happy to have experts come in to explain objective medical facts. All policy and all face of the campaign has to be the politician, because they are the people who are pulling the strings. Finally, they say if you don't like that politician, you're not going to listen to them. One, these politicians are stating law, and most people abide by the law. But second, those sorts of public health officials are also targeted. Fauci killed millions upon millions of people by not doing anything in the AIDS epidemic and let people die. People hate him. You are elite, you are someone that they've never met, someone that they've never listened to, someone that can be fired without you being able to vote them away, or someone who can keep getting paid. It is disgusting. The politicians need to realise that they are the ones that need to be held accountable.
Thanks very much, Emily.
It is a cliche in debating to say that we're going to win this debate because we save lives. But I've never been prouder to do it in today's debate. Because at the top of my speech, I'm going to give you 4 paths to victory of ways that our side of the house saves lives that side of the house with their wishy-washy, unmechanised democratic accountability won't ever have. Path 1. You believe that public health officials, when implementing the policy in the first place, will go stronger and harder than the government, which has to care about the economic incentives and the overriding incentives that exist on that government. Pathway 2. That a public platform for someone like Ashley Bloomfield or health officials gives a mechanism to criticise that government rather than the expert criticism buried at the bottom of a government report. It gives him a daily television slot where he can say something's not right about your public health response. Pathway 3. Politicians find it easier to backflip when they can blame someone else. That side of the House wanted, Boris Johnson to be the one who had to say that herd immunity failed. It's way easier for them to get the chief medical officer who say, we fucked up on herd immunity, we were wrong, the science was wrong, here's our brand new strategy. Why would Boris Johnson want to stand up and claim responsibility for sending tens and hundreds of thousands of people to their death? Maybe not saying that, well, actually, anyway. Pathway 4. No unresponded to until the last 45 seconds of Emily's speech about actually we get better cooperation with the public health advice that comes out. And that's not a joke on the side of the House, right? Because every time someone wears a mask, every time someone chooses to stay home instead of go out into the community, every single person is a weak link which causes deaths beyond that into the community. Man, Emily wants to usefully spend her time telling why Ashley Bloomfield wasn't a great communicator, but never wants to engage with the fact that half the population hates a third of the population hates Jacinda Ardern and doesn't want to listen to her, doesn't want to, they just actually want to oppose her for opposition's sake. So panel, if you want to give this debate against us, please come and tell me why we lose with all 4 metrics. Okay, let's talk about democratic accountability. Because here's the fundamental problem. Democratic accountability never worked on their side of the House. Note that the election is probably far away in this point of view, right? So the election, unless you're Sri Lanka, you're not holding elections during time of a COVID crisis. What that means is the only mechanism for accountability they had was 1, the opposition party critiquing the government, or 2, the resignation of a minister of that government, i.e. David Clark. Those are pretty weird mechanisms to get policy change for government, right? Because if David Clark's resigning, the government has to fess up and say, actually, we got it wrong. If you want to be held, that's not a mechanism that actually leads to direct accountability. Now, no, I skipped a bit where I was meant to talk about time. Just before I move on, about time. They tried to use time in a slippery slope way here. They said that actually we should wait longer. If we'd waited longer to close the border, or if the world had actually spent less time dithering and more time locking down, we would have saved tens of thousands of lives. But note it's not actually about, we accept that the first line of response was never going to be perfect from government. But the most important thing we tell you in this debate is how that response changes over time. And those were parts 2 and 3 to victory about how we got better influence of governments to change those mechanisms. Sorry, back on accountability, I'll give them the response.
Our mechanism of accountability, which we explained in every one of our speeches, is that health ministers are forced to front up to dozens of questions every day. Can you respond to our actual case?
Yeah, sure, but what does answering that question do, right? Okay, they look a bit like an idiot, but I don't understand how they go from minister looks like a bit of an idiot to policy change, right? Because the minister looks even more like an idiot when they go, oh yeah, actually, Tova, I got that wrong. I'm going to go change my policy now. It's way easier to get Ashley Bloomfield to be your political servant in that, and yes, maybe the full accountability doesn't fall on the government, but that's because we care about actually saving the lives of people. Okay, finally, they never engaged with other ways that we thought accountability was undermined. Firstly, about politicians have different incentives than public health officials have different incentives from the genuine populace. They care about minority communities who are overrepresented in deaths in the US. They care about elderly and care homes, but note also they care about the integrity of their hospitals to be able to provide effective public service and not be overloaded with hundreds of thousands with people through excess deaths causing that. Okay, finally, long-term accountability. Look, people can be held accountable in the long term when everything washes up. We can review the advice and we can hold governments accountable. What we cannot do is we give you the clearest path to how governments can quickly change their policy. Okay, on better decision making. First of all, we told you that actually countries were more likely to make better decisions by public health officials when they were able to blame public health officials for the extent or the damage of the lockdown. Particularly in progressive countries where there are huge conservative narratives about freedom, that has enabled government, particularly in all parts of the world, to do that. But note also, Asia has actually dealt with coronavirus really well through acting through their public health officials and following their advice. This debate doesn't exclusively take place in the UK. Okay, no. Let's talk about, okay, so let's move on to those other kinds of paths of victory, talk about influence and resignation. First of all, we think that resignation is probably most important in countries where the response is just abjectly bad, right? We gave you the examples of that are probably Bolsonaro or Trump in the US. We think of those examples, particularly as you as a public health official get your ability to do things undermined because Bolsonaro centralizes authority or Trump centralizes the CDC response, you get actually diminishing power in that. Your resignation sends a clear signal to people that the government is getting it wrong in that country and that there are problems. We tell you that Western and progressive countries, sure maybe actually Bloomfield was never ever going to resign, but we told you the types of mechanisms he could do. He has a platform to say things where he radically disagrees with the public health response. And yes, he might not have waited a couple of weeks for the level 3 discussion to come out, but if he thought it was critical enough that the government was making the abject wrong decision, we think that there's a much bigger stake in being able to say that. Thirdly, we think they can just say, they get bombarded with lots of questions from ministers. That's probably when a lot of their criticism leaks through. Media can spin that reporting and say that Ashley Bloomfield is critiquing the government in ways that side of the House doesn't understand. Okay, let's finally talk about unification in this debate. And note here, even though it's in my last 7 minutes, this is actually really, really important stuff because people's lives depend on our ability to follow the inactions of the coronavirus pandemic. Yes, maybe Ashley Bloomfield's not the best communicator, but actually it's really important that we don't find other political ways to undermine that perception of lockdown. The best example of this in the US is we've got lots of Democrats people marching in the streets against the Black Lives Matter movement. When they get told actually no, you should stay at home, they interpret that from a Republican government as telling them not their right to protest. We think if that message came from a public health official or someone who said actually your risk is that you're going to die, would probably be more likely to strike that. I have never been prouder in a debate to stand for the best public health advice we can have, for saving lives and protecting the will of the people. I am so, so proud to oppose.
Thank you very much for that, Zach, and that closes the substantive contributions. So I'll welcome back Umbar to deliver the curly reply.
Politicians are just pretty good at attacking other politicians, and that's why I just wanted to say that even in the face of a pandemic, suddenly political biases just fall away and you're all friends because you want to save people. If that were the case, this crisis wouldn't be happening, right? Because everyone would just agree that politics falls away and you can just focus on saving lives. The issue is that as soon as you open up for political debate, the immediate response is parties start negotiating down so they can continue to save their party line. So National doesn't have to say, we agreed with Labour that we didn't care about the economy in this instance. On our side of the House, you had National agreeing that Ashley Bloomfield probably was doing what was right by the country. The expert knows best. We care about recovery once we fix this crisis. That never happens under their side of the House, where you have political biases at play. That's what they needed to engage with. 2 questions in this debate. First, I'm going to quickly deal with how bargaining chips and negotiating power for health officials actually worked. And then secondly, talk about why we got the most effective responses that had the most buy-in. How did those bargaining chips work? Because AF outright denied that healthcare officials had any negotiating powers, but I think that their negotiating mechanisms were far worse, right? They stood behind political debate as the be-all end-all. Here's why that was so bad. Firstly, you just didn't get the best healthcare response, right? You negotiated down to National's economic safeguards to get those through. That probably meant that we would respond slower. The lives that we saved would be lost. I think that's the harm that happens when you take the weeks and weeks it takes to go through political debate, but even if they want to say that we push that stuff through faster, we still reckon you get faster action on our side of the House. But the second thing to say though is that you do just dither because it takes time for people to feedback on those processes if you want democracy to be the ultimate mechanism. Why do we think the expert gets radically more power on our side of the House, and why is that good? When Bloomfield was an absolute nobody, it was just unclear why Labour would ever propose to run a hardline lockdown on his word, right? They'd probably negotiate down to a softer party with National because they had to go through the political circus that they support. You don't get the expert as the face saying that a harsh lockdown is absolutely necessary because people don't know why they ought to trust that face. On our side of the house, you get better presence for these healthcare officials. They're able to gain the public's trust because of all the mechanisms we'll give you, and that means that you are more likely to get people buying in, but it also means you can just blame Ashley Bloomfield for running the hard line and save lives. Note that Ashley Bloomfield and all the other healthcare officials in this debate, by their own metric, were people who cared about saving lives. I think they're the kinds of people that are more likely to front up and say, I'll take the hit if I save lives. National, Labour, Trump, Biden, those are not the kinds of people that would ever take that political hit. Let's look at Biden, because these are great, effective communicators, importantly who are neutral, in a way that you note that Fossey's comparison in this debate is Biden and Trump. They don't tell you why that's better. These are people who talk to dumb politicians all the time in select committees, but they're also unique technocrats because people care about health, they care about saving their friends and family, they don't see them as removed robots. Importantly though, these are people who have trust across the political spectrum and so get less of the unconstructive criticism that happens under the affirming side of House. Trust was an important mechanism in this debate that we just think got insufficient response. Because even if, at our worst, the only policy we get through was face masks, you still need everyone to buy into using face masks in order for that to work. On their side of the House, it's unlikely you ever got that unified response. And note that this mechanism we give you deals with the 30 seconds we get in the affirming case about why healthcare officials are less impartial going on in the future. On our side of the House, you can show countries that healthcare experts are the best able to deal with the kinds of pandemics that impact lives. You place that trust in those people, so going forward, you trust the parties that rely on them. Healthcare manifestly improves under our side. We're so proud to oppose.
Thank you very much for that, Umbar. Now welcome back, Sam. Finish off for the day.
Make sure and stuff is outside, so everybody will be ready to leave as soon as the speakers open. It's 3 p.m. So they're meant to be on right now.
I'm at risk of displaying my political stripes here, but throughout the beginning of the COVID response in New Zealand, we had an idiot named David Clark who was making decisions that fundamentally impacted people's lives. And that idiot had almost zero accountability because he was able to offload almost all of the decisions that he personally was making on political incentives off to someone else. And he shuffled that off to someone else who believed that they had to look after people, that believed that they couldn't resign, that they had to go along with what the government was saying because that was the decision and they had to present that decision and had to help people buy into that. And that is why Ashley Bloomfield only ever critiques the government's response after the fact. He didn't at the time when we were changing it to level 3 complain, he complained about it after. And that is because the critique simply does not exist. I'm going to work through firstly the quality of initial decision making. Secondly, I'm going to talk about the quality of ongoing decision making. And as part of that process, I'm going to specifically reference why each of Zach's 4 bullshit reasons are inaccessible to his team in this debate. Firstly, quality of initial decision. Zach's first pathway to winning the debate, he made up in his speech. Health officials go harder and stronger. They don't make the decisions, and that team never supported them making the decisions. It was never in the debate. It was weird. Second, he says, politicians change their minds because they can scapegoat Ashley Bloomfield, etc., and therefore they'll be more likely to go back on themselves. Here's the problem. We set up from the very beginning of this debate that politicians would never have made the decision to go, for example, with the herd immunity policy in the UK and in Sweden, because in the first instance that decision would have been subject to public scrutiny. The counterfactual, what actually happened in Britain and in Sweden, is that politicians were able to go with a soft line that was politically advantageous to them. And I explained that in my substantive. And it is remarkable how little my substantive has been responded to by that side of the House. I told you that politicians have political incentives to go soft on the response in order to buy votes in the future, and then just blame it on the hands tied thing if things go wrong. So in the counterfactual, actually what happens is, or in our world, actually what happens is you have some level of robust discussion. Politicians are held to account for the decisions that they make rather than being able to offload that decision. This side of the house has a bizarre utopian view of the world that says that these politicians just want to do the best thing out there and they're going to go hard and fast, and when they make decisions things will change. In reality, what they supported was a system that was fundamentally undemocratic that allowed David Clark to stay in the driver's seat for months, and the man was an idiot. And that's all I have to say about that. Secondly, the quality of ongoing decision making. We get better decision makers because politicians have personal and political incentives to learn themselves up, to know what they're talking about, and that's important because they're the people making the decisions. But on top of that, you have political incentives within the party to put actual experts in charge. There are doctors in the Labour Party. Put them in the portfolio instead of David Clark, right? Political incentives never ever responded to by that side of the house. Second, we get good decisions because of the political pressure that I've explained, and because of the shield that Ashley Bloomfield provides. Ashley Bloomfield cannot simultaneously stand up and say, we have had 15 new infections today, we are still on level 3, and simultaneously criticise level 3 because he undermines the own thing that he's trying to push. Ashley Bloomfield recognises that a suboptimal response is still better than no response. So he does not resign and he does not critique until after the fact, and they were unable to explain why, and they were unable to explain the reality of the world, which was just that they were making it up. We say that you actually get more critique and you get more of engagement with the actual policy in the world where you don't have that protection. Finally, on buy-in. Firstly, this is only important insofar as they have good policies. Given that we have demonstrated that our policies are significantly better, even if there is marginally less buy-in, that still wins us the debate. But it remains unclear why you trust Anthony Fauci, a man who has presided over a COVID response that has killed hundreds of thousands of people, that his palms were symmetrical.
Yeah, someone else first, I'm gonna grab my bag.